Hey guys, my name is Brandi and I have Art by Blush. And if you've ever been into Artistry on Main in Buchanan, I have some work over there that's for sale. And I'm going to do a video today on explaining just various art supplies that you can use for mixed media. I use a lot of different things in my work. I don't just use acrylic paint. I use watercolors and water-soluble crayons and pastels and pen and ink and just a lot of really fun stuff. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today to give you an idea of some of the options that you have to create your art. So first, let's talk about paper. There's so many different surfaces that you can create on, and I'm not even going to be able to touch the surface of that. We're just going to go through a few things that I've been using of late. As I mentioned, I've been doing the art journaling, so I've been doing a lot of stuff on mixed media paper. But the first thing we're going to talk about is Bristol. Now it has this really nice, smooth vellum surface. And it's not so much for wet media, but it's great for dry media. I do a lot of pencil, pen and ink, markers, some pastels on this. So this is something that's very versatile. It's very heavy. Strathmore makes a great brand. That's the brand that I've been using for the last probably 20 years. And it's fairly inexpensive as well. Again, as I mentioned, mixed media and art journaling, I've also been working in these amazing Strathmore art journals. They're 90-pound paper. I do have to gesso those because I'm a little heavy on the wet media, but they too have a really nice smooth surface. And later in the video, we're actually going to talk about different forms of media that you can use to prepare your surface. So you can prepare it to be, a little toothier, a little more rough as well. But these are what I've been working out of here lately. And I'm actually going to show you a few pieces once we get deeper into the video of things that I've done in the journals. Now, this is something that I do use a lot, is watercolor paper. You want to make sure that it is 140 pounds or above in order to handle all the wet media. And there's a couple different types. I've been working with the Fabriano and Arches brands, but Canson makes a great brand that is also 140 pounds that you can use as well. This one is actually cold press. And what cold press means with watercolor paper is that it is a much rougher surface, so it does tend to grab the media a little bit better. I still gesso it since I am heavy on the water, but there is also... Talking about paper, I have been doing a lot of mixed media in my journals, and one of the journals that I use is the Strathmore Visual Journal Mixed Media. It is 140 pounds. No, I'm sorry, it's 90 pounds. I do have to gesso it, but I'm just going to show you a few things that I've done in the journals and give you an idea of some of the mixed media. So this one isn't finished, but this is for a prompt for a group that I'm in that encourages you to do art daily. And as you can see, I did gesso this, which you can't see, but I used various forms of media in this. So just to let you know, there's watercolor, there's pastel, there's ink, there is pen, different colors of pen, and I use a lot of white ballpoint pens to kind of give out that detail, and we're going to go into that a little more later. I mentioned different medias to prepare your paper for your work, and I'm going to explain a few of the ones that I have been using. So one of my favorites is this pastel ground. It's an acrylic primer, and it gives the paper a lot of tooth, and it's really cool to work with the watercolor in there because it gives it that loose look. It also is awesome with using your pastels, any medium really. But you prepare your paper with this and it gives it more of a textured, rougher surface. I also gesso everything, which gives it a little more tooth, but this also strengthens the paper, especially with your watercolor work. And I use this Blick white gesso. You can use black gesso, you can use clear gesso, but I'm pretty fond of the white gesso. Really brightens up the paper, but it does not have as much of a tooth as the pastel ground. So it really comes down to preference. The next thing that I want to talk about that I absolutely am in love with, because I like to Mod Podge, and I do use that a lot, but I use that a lot on some of my furniture pieces, is this Liquitex matte medium. And you can use it also to do collages. It can act as a glue, it can act as a sealant, and I have been using that a lot to glue down my collage work for the background of my pieces, and I will show an example of that later in the video. But you can use the Mod Podge as well if you don't have access to the Liquitex matte medium, but I really have fell in love with that medium. Another one that I use is this pastel ground. It has a little tooth. It's an acrylic primer. It doesn't have as much tooth as the absorbent ground, but I would say that it is in between the gesso and the absorbent ground. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about that later as well. I use a lot of the coarse texture gel and the modeling paste to give my pieces dimension, because they're very heavy. You apply them with a palette knife, and you can use it for hair, you can use it for the background, you can make their clothes with it if you're doing like whimsical girls, which is what I've been working on. You can use it for landscape pieces to give it that texture, but it's very thick. It's almost like applying drywall mud. So it's a really cool thing to use in your artwork for that added dimension, kind of a 3D effect. I have here some of the gloss gel medium. Now, you can also glue down your collages with this as well. The only problem I have with the gloss is if you're going to use it as more of a sealant. You can't go back and really draw over it like you can with the matte medium that I showed you a few minutes ago. And then I also have another type of gesso that I like that's really thick. It's white and it comes in a tube, and it's Liquitex, and you can use it with acrylic paint, you can use it with pen and ink, you can use it with watercolors, crayons, whatever you're working your piece up in. We're going to talk a little bit about watercolors, and please keep in mind that in this video we are barely touching the surface of everything that is available to you as an artist to use in your artwork. The first thing that I want to mention for watercolors is there's several different types, and I use all of them. There is fine liquid, there's tubes, there's pan. So here's some of the things that I've been using lately that I really like. I have discovered the Dr. P.H. Martin fine liquid watercolors. And what's really cool about these is they come with a dropper, and they are very pigmented, so it doesn't take much to use them. And what I do is I usually mix my tubes and my liquid watercolors in these palettes, and you can just let them dry up because you're going to reactivate them with water later. And you just add a little water to the liquid, and voila, you're ready to go. So we also use a lot of the tubes. I'm really fond of Core and Daniel Smith. Whatever you have on hand will do. These are very pigmented, very bright colors. And again, I put those in my pan and I get them, really wet and messy. As you can see, I'm very messy with my watercolors. And I have everything ready to go, so I'm ready to use it. I pull out the pan that the color's in, and I'm ready to go. Another thing that I really like that I use a lot in my artwork is gouache. So gouache comes in, you can get them in these little containers like this. You can get them in tubes. I really like the Winsor Newton Designer gouache. Been using that since college. And they're really cool because you can use them in several different ways. They are more opaque than a watercolor, but you can thin them out and use them like a watercolor, or you can leave them a little thicker and use them in your acrylic work, which I do both ways. I've also used gouache in my collage work to paint the white over something so that I can paint and draw back over it later. Gesso works for that as well. The other watercolors that I have been using are these beautiful pan watercolors, and I tend to just mix those up in my lid. If I run out of room, because I am very messy, then I will pull out another palette. But these you just mix in the pans usually. Get these really wet. They too are very pigmented, and then you can mix them, blend them however you want to do with your color, either in a palette. I usually use the lids of my pans. So the one I've been using here lately a lot is Jane Davenport. Her colors are very bright. They're very cheerful. So those are some options that you have when you're doing some watercolor painting or doing that with your mixed media. I also want to mention that in the watercolor realm of possibilities, there's watercolor pencils, and I use these Faber-Castell because they are extremely pigmented. They come in a variety of colors. They are a little more on the expensive side of watercolor pencils, but they create such beautiful images that I've absolutely fallen in love with those. But I'm going to give you a short demonstration and swatch out each of the watercolor mediums just so you can kind of see how they work. I didn't mention that gouache also reactivates with water, so that's something to remember too. If you squeeze that out in your container, that you can bring it back to life with water as well. Don't mind my beautiful art mess that you're going to see in the background, but I have stuff everywhere as I move around my house and create. The first thing I wanted to show you is this Faber-Castell watercolor pencil. So we're just gonna shade a spot here on the paper. I'm gonna show you the variance in color on that. Now, you can also use these watercolor pencils just to draw with. You can do just pencil pieces with them as well. They're just so lovely and pigmented. And when I sketch out my pieces that I do, I use a water soluble pencil to do my sketches with. It doesn't matter what color, because then my lines are going to disappear. But I usually stick to like a really light blue or purple. I find that doesn't muddy my watercolors, and that's what I use for my sketching, so that those lines that you don't want people to see will disappear, or maybe you want people to see them for a looser version of your drawing. I'm just going to wet a brush. A little water off there, and just show you how nice that color gets. And as you can see how much pigment is in that pencil, and it can go light or as dark as you want. Usually you want to start lighter in watercolor, and see how well that blends and how smooth it is. And the one thing I do like about the watercolor pencils is they give a little bit of grain to your picture, so I really like that in my paintings, because it kind of gives it some interesting texture. We're gonna swatch the pan watercolors now. Seems to be like we're on a blue theme, so the pans come in these little cakes and of color, and you get those really wet. At least that's how I do it. And I put a little here on my palette lid, add a little more water. And this is from the Jane Davenport pan set Bright that I mentioned earlier in the video. And you can just see how nice and smooth that is as we're working. And you can always add a little bit more water, thin it out. But look at that nice color gradient that it gives you. The next one that I want to show you is the Dr. P.H. Martin liquid watercolor. So I'm going to squeeze out the excess. See, as I mentioned, it comes in the dropper, which is really cool. And I just put 1 or 2 drops in there, depending on how much I need. And it's very pigmented, so that by itself is going to be very dark. Let me show you with a dry brush here. See how pigmented and dark that is. So I'm going to add a little water to it, thin it out. So I always want to start light so I can build up my layers. Just keep adding a little water there. Squeeze out the excess. And you can see how nice that flows on the paper. Look at that. Watercolor kind of has a mind of its own. It just kind of goes in the direction it wants to. And there's 2 different ways you can paint with watercolor. You can do dry on dry or wet on wet. Wet on wet means you're going to wet your subject before you add the color. Dry on dry means, well, it's wet on dry. I'm sorry, means you're going to just, you're not going to wet the paper first. So you can see how pretty that watercolor just flows. I want to show you how you can reactivate your pan. So for this one, we're going to use this little purple here, and this is also the P.H. Martin's. And I'm just going to grab a little bit of it. Again, it's very pigmented, and show you a little swatch from that. So that was a dry on my palette, and I reactivated that with a little water. And you see how nicely that swatches out. I'm going to squeeze a little gouache into my palette, and you can see here that it is very thick, but I did mention that you can thin it out, reactivate it with water. So many cool options that you can do with that. Use it if you want it thicker, use it thick, but I'm going to thin it out with some water, and we're going to swatch that. Put that up so you can see. I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. Just add a little more. Thin that out just a little bit more, and we're going to swatch it out, and look there, it looks just like you're using watercolor. I'm going to show you how to use it the other way too. As I mentioned, it has a lot of different uses as well. Now you may want to use it a little thicker, so I'm going to pull out a dry brush. And I'm going to show you what the swatch will look like with it being a little thicker. And it's more like acrylic paint. It doesn't have the smoothness. It's not flowing like the watercolor. And again, we'll add a little water, and you can use it as a watercolor. I use it both ways. I use it for a lot of stuff in my work. The last one I want to mention is your tube. Now I always do this. Every time I open it, it starts coming out and it's like not stopping. But this is a tube of the Daniel Smith, and we are actually going to use the Duochrome Aquamarine for this one, this swatch. And this has a really nice dimensional grain. I mean, it's just it's almost like it's translucent. And shiny and glittery. I don't know how to explain it, but I love that line of the duochromes. And we're just gonna add a little water to that. And swatch that out so you can see. I think I need a little more water. How pretty that is. It's almost transparent, so if you want you know it to be a deeper color for this particular tube, you're going to want to add a little bit more. But it just has this nice fairy tale, is what I call it. Look, very pretty. The cores, I have those, the watercolors, the other two watercolors, I have them squeezed out in my palette right now. And as I said before, you're gonna reactivate any of that with water. That's why I save all my palettes and have everything ready to go when I'm ready to start a piece. One thing I forgot to mention that I use a lot that's really cool in the beginning as far as water media is these Faber-Castell gelatos. They come in every color of the rainbow, and you can use them like you would use pastels or crayons and blend them with your fingers, or you can paint with them. So we'll just swatch this one out, and this is raspberry. It looks more purple to me. Do a nice little swatch right there. Make sure you can see that. And it looks more like a crayon when it goes down. I use these a lot in backgrounds, not in fine work because they're kind of big size, almost like a crayon. But I just want to lift this up here and just kind of show you the green on that and the texture. And then we are going to wet that down a little bit. I still have a little blue in my water there. And you can see as you wet that down and make your swatch, it's just like using a watercolor. And it does kind of leave some of that green in there when you're using it and you're smoothing it out, but it gives the painting a really cool effect, especially in your backgrounds. I like the way that it makes your skies and your clouds look three-dimensional. So another thing that I didn't mention in the water medium is that I have been using these watercolor pens. So these all come pre-made with their color. These are also Jane Davenport. She has some really bright, lovely colors, and I love a lot of bright color in my work. And you can use these just like a watercolor, and the tip of it is like a brush. So it's like you're brushing that on there, and I'm gonna swatch one for you so you can see how it works. But you can also get them where they're empty, and they'll have the brush on the tip, and you can pre-fill them with ink. You can pre-fill them with paint, watercolor, water, and do all kinds of neat things on the go. So they're really easy to take with you. So I'm gonna just add a little water, and I do want to mention that I keep like 3 or 4 jars of water because your jars are going to get muddy with your colors, and I dip that in there. And if I want to release the paint, you just press right here and it'll come out. But we're going to swatch that. And as you can see, you have a little more control over this. Versus maybe using a brush. And these are cool to take on the go. And if I want to like a little bit more thinner color, I just add more water by dipping the tip into the water. So I think that wraps up some of the water medium that I use, and next we're going to talk about all the different ink options and cool things that you can do with that. I have just discovered the coolest thing for mixed media paintings, and that would be ink. And I like a lot of bright color, neon colors, so I started with that. And one of the cool things that you can do with the ink, and I'll show you what I'm using. I'm using the Dollar Rowney FW inks, and I'm using neon, and they come in these cool little containers. They have little droppers. Get that off there. And some of the cool things you can do with them is you can dilute them with water. This one's waterproof, but you can dilute it with water, and it is an acrylic ink. And you can drop, you know, a little bit of ink in there for some interest to your painting. You can also use a brush to brush it on. But one of the cool things that I have done that I like, and you can get these little containers on Amazon for a very inexpensive price, is I got these little spray bottles. And I like to, and you can do this different ways. And I would recommend, if you're going to set your painting up, to go outside, because this is a bit messy. But as you can see, I've got all of them labeled. Some of them I've pre-diluted with water, like this one. And that one's actually another Jane Davenport product. It's her Incredible ink. And you can use it without diluting it also. But you can also just spray it on your page, and you don't know what it's gonna do. I mean, it's, it's definitely a risk, but it's a risk worth taking. So, shake that up. You can spray your ink on the page. That one's not spraying very well today. Let's try another color. It might be clogged. I try to clean these as I go, but sometimes I forget. This one's spraying really nice. And this one I've diluted with water before I put it into the bottle. You can do that before you even paint on there. You can paint, do layers of ink. Gives it that really cool spray painted effect. As I mentioned, you can also paint with them. So just to show you real quickly, that one's just a dropper. We'll try the, oh, it looks like I forgot to label this one. It's red, neon red. Just sit there for me. Okay. So I'm just gonna dip my brush in there, get the excess off, and hopefully you can see there. Not sure if that's showing up. You can paint with it too. Use it just like you would your paint. So you can use black, white, any color you want. I also draw with some of the black and white inks. I use the white for highlighting sometimes. One thing about some of the inks is they're not light fast, so if you're doing your artwork with those, you're gonna wanna not sell something that's got the ink in it. You'll probably wanna make a print of it. But there you have it with ink, and I'm still working on all the different ways to use it, so that's not everything that I'm sure you can do with it. Back to water media real quick. I forgot to mention that I use a lot of these water soluble pencils that are like a regular number 2 pencil, except you can go back in and wet them down and paint with them. So I want to swatch one for you real quick. You can see there it looks just like a pencil. This particular brand is Brandi Losh. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But I've been doing a lot of sketching with them, and then you can go back in and paint the details with your shading and things that you've done in your sketch. So I'm gonna hold this up here for you so you can see the pencil. And then we're going to swatch that out. And just real quickly here, see how cool that is? Just wet that out, and it's almost like you're painting with a number 2 pencil. Great for shading, just if you want to do a drawing with just pencil and then go back in and make it look like a painting. So we just barely scratched the surface of everything that's available to you as an artist to use to create your work. I didn't even get into great detail in everything that I showed you because there's just so much information out there, and you can, of course, Google it, Pinterest it, however you surf the internet. But the last few slides are examples of my work using a lot of what I showed you today. I want to say that a couple of them were lessons from Jane Davenport and Tamara Laporte, so I want to give them credit for that. But I want to thank you for watching my video, and if you're ever in Buchanan, West Virginia, please stop by Artistry on Main and check out all the great artists that are in there.